Dr. Neil Websdale will present what happens before an intimate partner homicide. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. As you can see on the slide, we have disabled the public chat feature. If you have a question, you can type it into the box on the tab marked Room. This will open a new tab connecting you with the moderators. The moderators may not reply directly to you, but your questions will be collected. If your question does not receive a response during the session, please feel free to email us using the contact information at the end of the presentation. Please make sure your volume is turned up on your speakers. You can also adjust the volume using the bar above the video button. I would also like to announce NDVFRI's National Conference in May 2015 in St. Petersburg, Florida. Fatality Review, Communities, and Social Change will explore ways communities have changed their responses to domestic violence as a result of their fatality review work. Registration is open, and we encourage you to visit our website at www.ndvfri.org to learn more about the conference and register. There is a Sister Summit taking place on May 20th, 2015. This summit is hosted by the Family Violence Institute and focuses on the intersections between child and adult fatality review. Please visit our website for more information and to register. I would also just like to take an opportunity to briefly introduce our presenter. Professor Neil Websdale is director of the newly formed Family Violence Institute at Northern Arizona University and director of the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative. He has published work on domestic violence, the history of crime, policing, social change, and public policy. His social policy work involves helping establish networks of domestic violence fatality review teams across the United States and elsewhere. He has also worked on issues related to community policing, full faith and credit, and risk assessment and management in domestic violence cases. Dr. Websdale trained as a sociologist at the University of London, England, and currently lives and works in Flagstaff, Arizona. So I will turn it over to Dr. Websdale.
Thanks very much, Stephanie, and welcome, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. I'm going to speak from really two perspectives. One is as a reviewer of cases all over the country, review work that I've been doing for 20 years as director of NDVFRI. And then secondly, my perspective as a researcher and writer about these cases. And so I'm going to blend the practical case review elements with the research literature and try and dip into both. So I'd like to commence by talking about, just briefly, domestic violence related deaths. And we can see, if we look at this array of deaths, that there are many, many more deaths than initially meet the eye. And I've just grouped some of these for listeners. The focus of today's work is on intimate partner homicide, and that's what I'm referring to when I talk about single homicides. Usually those cases involve men killing women, or women killing men, probably in anywhere from 20 to 35% of cases, depending on various socio-demographic variables. But in most cases, it seems, where women kill men, there is a history of domestic violence directed at the woman that takes the form of woman battering. It's an unusual case. There are cases in the literature, and certainly I've worked those cases, where women are the primary aggressors and they end up killing. But often what we see is either mutual violence in those cases or long-term chronic woman battering. So the single cases are the focus of the vast majority of the research, and it's there we have the best research. And clearly those cases are also the principal focus of the fatality review work that's going on in 41 states across the country. But we'd be remiss if we didn't mention many of the multiple killings that we have. And the multiple homicides include a significant number of homicide-suicides, and probably about a third of women who are murdered in this country every year by their intimate partners are murdered during the commission of a homicide-suicide. And in about 95% of those cases, the perpetrator is the male intimate partner who then takes his own life. And again, we need to mention familicides, which we've seen a significant increase in since the 2008 recession. Those years, 2009, 2010, saw a marked increase in those killings. And this is typically where, and again, 95% plus these perpetrators are men who kill their entire families and then kill themselves. And it seems as if, from the research, there are two principal groups of offenders here. We have the classic batterer who kills after a long campaign of abuse and tyranny and violence. But then we have, I think, a smaller group, perhaps a third of offenders, who kill where there seems to be, to all of our indicators, no history of domestic violence, perhaps some very rigid control issues in the relationship, perhaps pending, how can I put this, bankruptcy or foreclosure on a mortgage or something like that. But you know, usually there's some kind of event that causes the man in that relationship to have a significant amount of shame in his relationship, which he translates into violence misguidedly. So those are the single and the multiple killings. We also need to note the family killings, of which there are many, and here we see typically brothers killing brothers. We see you know, parents killing children, you know, children killing parents. All these would come under the rubric of domestic violence killings, and often these family killings occur within the context, adult context, of domestic violence and abuse. So single and multiple homicides a year in general, if we were to take those killings, we probably see similar numbers of single and multiple homicides if we combine them to family killings, although the data on this isn't entirely clear. Sexual competitor killings involve men killing men, usually. It's rare for us to see a woman killing a woman over a man. But often the old abusive partner is incensed by the arrival of a new male competitor on the scene. There's an altercation and one kills the other. So these are significant cases as well, and they should be the focus of our safety planning activities too. We then have a large number of cases which are broadly referred to as suicides. And again, we really don't have enough data on this, and we need this data, but our estimates are that large numbers of women who are in battering relationships, probably as large as those that die in intimate partner homicides, commit suicide each year to exit those violent, controlling, tyrannical relationships. If you think that roughly 8,000 women a year commit suicide, our evidence out there varies, but anywhere from maybe 10 to 25, 30%, even in some jurisdictions, of suicides are considered suspicious and have prior histories of DV. That gives us a large number of female suicides a year. Now, you take the CDC data, about 32,000 men a year commit suicide in this country. And we really have no idea how many of those men are either perpetrators or indeed victims of domestic violence, and that too is a huge issue. And then, if I could just advance the slides, we have what we call indirect deaths. These are deaths of women, typically from things like HIV/AIDS infections that are linked to domestic violence. Women die on the street from homelessness. Drug-addicted women, sex workers. Often these women have histories of domestic violence in their biographies. And we have a significant number of cases of near fatalities, which many death review teams are reviewing. And again, probably for every intimate partner homicide, we have 10 near misses or near fatalities. And some review teams, as I say, have taken to reviewing those. There are a significant number too of bystander deaths. People killed in workplaces, in public spaces like malls. And there was an article just yesterday in the New York Times linking multiple killings, mass killings in public space to domestic violence, because, you know, anywhere from up to probably 50% of those offenders who kill in those public spaces have prior histories of domestic violence. Some of the very prominent killings of late, the killings in Boston, for example, had that prior DV history. And then, of course, we see cases of accidents, disappearances, suspicious deaths. Again, all of these come under the rubric, potentially, of domestic violence. So one of the things that we look for in terms of what happens before domestic violence is what's the type of domestic violence that we see in these cases. And I just want to lay out a couple of points here. There's a lot of domestic violence that goes down in people's lives that we call situational couple violence. It's not to minimize the significance of this, but this is sort of stress release violence between individuals. We see a lot of this back and forth between men and women. The survey data, Mary Strauss's work, and the large amount of survey data we have on this shows that there's a lot of symmetry in this, sex symmetry in this. And again, we don't really know, but it seems like there's a lot of back and forth between men and women. This is not the stuff that we see as in the build-up to homicides. What we see in the build-up to homicides is what Michael Johnson has called intimate terrorism, what Evan Stark has called coercive control. These are the core elements of what we see in the prior history of domestic violence in the death cases. So when we look at what happens before, we often see that history. And I'm going to talk more in a moment about the elements of intimate terrorism, coercive control that are significant markers for us. And then I just wanted to mention mutual combat. I've reviewed a number of cases over the years where there appears to be mutual combat in just a very small percentage of intimate partner homicides. In many of those cases, that mutual combat, when you really dig deeply, looks as though it's male-initiated originally. But again, we need more data on this and more research on this. So part of the reason for addressing this topic concerns the current rise in risk assessment and management in agencies across the country that deal with domestic violence cases. And we have to deal with these questions of how do we triage, how do we provide resources to a very large number of cases, how do we sift out the cases where it appears to be the danger level is much higher. And this is not a foolproof science, but again, what I want to do today is make a few points about this. First of all, we're obsessed, I think, with notions of security and notions of prediction. And I think we have to get this out of the way at the front end and say that we cannot pinpoint and predict which cases are going to result in death and which cases are not, which ones are going to be near deaths. What we have with the risk assessment literature is a research, body of research that is extremely useful, and then I think what we have to emphasize is looking at clusters of risk markers and the way in which they synergize each other and work with each other. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. I do think it's very important for us to distinguish matters of time in our cases. How long do risks last for? We obviously can't protect people indefinitely, so we have to ask the question, you know, does risk fade with time? And again, there's a caveat here because clearly we've had cases that we've reviewed through the initiative where he has returned a year later to kill, or indeed, a case I'm working on at the moment, where he has returned 10 years later to kill. So, you know, usually the period immediately after separation seems to be the most vulnerable, but we'll talk about that later. But when we do risk assessment work, I think the ideal, the gold standard for risk assessment work is what I call rolling or longitudinal risk assessment. It's not one-off cross-sectional risk at a certain point in time. We have to be aware in our risk work with police departments, shelters, shelter programs, etc., even hospital emergency rooms for that matter, that risk changes. So adding information to case files as we move forward is a better way of doing it. I think it's also important to specify which people are threatened. Clearly, the battered woman, or indeed the male victim occasionally, is the person threatened, but there are usually other people involved in these cases. And specifying who is the target of the threat is important. And this is particularly important, I think, working in the civil court arena around child custody issues, visitation issues, we see a lot of threats issued discreetly sometimes towards children that we ought to be perhaps asking questions about. We also need to look carefully at the issue of what are we assessing the risk of? Are we assessing the risk of lethality? Are we assessing the risk of near death or serious injury? Domestic violence homicide, intimate partner homicide, is a very rare event statistically. So predicting homicide is extremely difficult, and we don't have the refined risk assessment tools to do that. We can't just say simplistically that, oh, we can predict it, therefore we can prevent it. I think it's much more complicated than that when you get into the nitty-gritty of reviewing cases. So specifying the damage, specifying perhaps the level of dangerousness strikes me as very important. And then one thing here to bear in mind is really whose perspective are we looking at? Is it the perspective of a particular police department, for example, that's conducting a screen that says this victim is at, a very high risk or a very low risk? Or are we looking at the perspective of the victim herself? The victim's file may suggest that she's at low risk, but she may convey the sense that she's at high risk. So we have to be careful with those assessments of potential damage and what the threat is. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about victim perceptions of risk and risk assessment score predictions of risk and how those two stack up against each other. But the content of our screening tools is well developed. We have large numbers of risk markers. I will talk about some of them today. We will continue to add to them as we do more research. We'll continue to refine them and improve our odds ratios when we look at those risk markers. But the point I wanted to talk about a little bit more is about the context and the meaning of violence in relationships. I think it's important to ask of every risk marker, what's the context within which this is occurring? What's the meaning of this to the different parties involved? The latest large body of research that we have is the Homicide review process in Ontario, Canada. And they published some research just last year where they looked at a large number of homicides over a period of 10, 11 years. And what they found was that in 86% of the cases, there were 7 or more risk markers present. So this again speaks to the issue of clustering. So when we look at these risk assessment tools, the clustering piece is important. I think there are a number of ethical issues that we need to address about how we do risk assessment. There's a large body of literature in the social sciences that talks about building rapport, establishing confidence and trust and respect between people doing risk assessments to really build a sense that the person you're interviewing is going to convey risky information. And clearly, this depends on when you're doing it, the context, the meaning, how you're doing it, if you're doing it at a crime scene, if you're doing it during crisis, if you're doing it after admission to a shelter, if you're doing it in a hospital emergency room where perhaps the offender is nearby or the suspect. These are all different contexts, but the context will affect the information that we get. And victims, survivors are going to screen what they give systems players anyway. So they're going to convey, selectively information that may be important to us. So how we do the risk assessment, how we approach it is important. I worked a case a few months ago where a risk assessment was conducted by a police officer on the street while he was texting on his cell phone, while he was interacting with the victim allegedly. So not making eye contact, and this is not to criticize the police officer, but it's just to say that there are ways and ways of doing this, and in general, establishing rapport and paying attention and being present emotionally in other ways is very important. There are a number of other ethical considerations, and again, there's a literature on there. There's a controversial literature, but are battered women or are victims of domestic violence, male victims included, are they really in a position to give informed consent? Given that these are not foolproof predictive instruments, are we really in a good position to ask victims risk questions without asking their consent first to do that, rather like we would ask their consent before they enter a medical procedure? And again, I'm throwing this out as a question because it's out there in the field. Do we need to think about giving victims risk assessment scores? How do we weigh the impact of giving them those scores versus scaring them, educating them, informing their safety planning? How do we do this? Clearly, these are questions. Do victims, as some researchers and lawyers have suggested, do victims have a right not to be screened, not to hear the results of screens, the right not to be directed towards particular courses of action like being connected with shelter services or program services, for example? And then there's this very thorny issue, and again, I'm speaking about caveats here. There's this very, very thorny, difficult issue of discovery, disclosure of information. If the information in the risk assessment that you conduct enters the police file, for example, enters the system, then the batterer, the suspect, has access to that information. Does that then increase her risk? Does it decrease her risk? We really do not know the answers to that question. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to be thoughtful about how we do this work. So let me move on now and talk about some of the specific markers and the things that both the research literature documents as occurring clearly in cases, and the research literature on this has been pioneered by researchers such as Dr. Jacqueline Campbell at Johns Hopkins and many others. And Campbell conducted basically a case-controlled study of 220 cases of women who were murdered through intimate partner homicide, comparing them with 343 cases of women who'd been abused in the preceding 2 years but were still alive. So in other words, we're comparing women who died or had been murdered with women who, in fact, were still living. So in other words, the death cases, we wanted to see the differences between the death cases and the control cases. And one of the strongest markers that Campbell's group found was this issue of a prior history of domestic violence. And I wanted to point out just a few of the principal markers here that struck them, that group, as important. One of the strong markers was prior weapons use. And here we're talking typically about use of guns or knives against victims. Campbell's group found a very powerful difference between the death group and the control group around weapons use. So that emerges as a significant red flag. Attempted strangulation also emerges as a significant red flag. And again, with the strangulation, it's difficult to know sometimes if this has occurred. It's difficult to unravel what form this took. Again, as someone who's ridden to crime scenes on and off for 20 years, I know that it's very difficult sometimes for police officers, for example, to make a determination about what was going on in these situations. If you've got an abuser who's claiming that he's defended himself, for example, by holding her by the throat because she had, cut him with her nails first or whatever, it's very difficult sometimes to work this out. But the strangulation is a strong correlate of intimate partner homicide. Forced sex is another strong correlate of intimate partner homicide. Campbell found a difference between the death group and the control group with forced sex of about a 7-fold difference. One thing that we observe at the initiative in cases is the combination between attempted strangulation or non-fatal strangulation, forced sex. When those two are put together, it seems to be a particularly potent cocktail, if I can put it that way. Threats to kill also emerged, and the literature on threats to kill, again, is tricky. There are a lot of threats to kill in cases, but I think one thing we try to pay attention to is not just whether there's been a threat to kill, but what form that threat takes, how many times that threat has been issued. There seems to be no correlation, and we have cases where the threat is issued once, and we have cases where the threat is issued 15 times before the killing. So it's very difficult. David Adams' work on this has been very good. Why Does He Kill? That David published in 2007, his interviews with male offenders who killed. So some men seem to build to the kill. Others seem to kill quickly after threatening to kill. Access to weapons is important. Stalking. The work of Judith McFarlane and co-researchers published in the late 90s and through the early 2000s finds that stalking, surveillance of routines doubles the risk of homicide or attempted homicide in these cases. We look to some of the latest research that has really pioneered with these risk markers, and I'd like to spend a few moments talking about the research of Carolyn Snyder et al. That was published in Academic Emergency Medicine in 2009. And Snyder really, I think that group of researchers, which Jacqueline Campbell is a co-author, really have made some major strides in working out what the top risk markers are. So I want to say a few words about that research and just mention the top 5 risk markers from that research, because it synthesizes a lot of the earlier research. The most significant risk marker is this: has the physical violence increased in frequency or severity over the past 6 months? And this is something that we see all the time in case reviews in the field. I refer to this in my everyday language as escalation. And this escalation can take a number of forms. Clearly, we can see escalation if we want to measure, say, for example, police calls to the residence, or trips to the hospital emergency room for injuries. We can map this, we can diary this, we can do it to time, and we can see the escalation. And unfortunately, when we do death reviews, this is often what we see, but we can't see that in the live case because we're working it in the moment. So this is a warning for us, this risk marker, that when we do domestics, when we work domestic violence cases, these are not cases that are just one-off cases in time. They are cases of accumulation, and these homicides are crimes of accumulation. And knowing that is important. And this risk marker data clearly shows us that's the most important question to ask. Has the physical violence increased in frequency or severity over the past 6 months? Now, we have to be a little bit careful with this because the official record may not signify that there has been an increase. However, the victim herself may signify that there has been an increase, and that may not comport with our official record. So reconciling these two sources, listening to victims, is important. And we're well aware that victims may not disclose accurately for all kinds of reasons. But trying to reconcile those two bodies of information is nevertheless important. The second major risk marker from Snyder et al.'s work: is he violently and constantly jealous of you? And the key here is violently and constantly. Most people have rules of access in their intimate relationships. Jealousy is a common feeling. But we're talking here about constant jealousy associated continuously with violence. That seems to be a potent risk marker. And I'm going to return to the issue of obsessive possessiveness and jealousy in just a moment. The third most significant risk marker that Snyder et al. Identified is this. This question is key. Do you believe he is capable of killing you? That is a very important question to ask. And again, it's that sense of victim perspective. And many times, sadly, in these cases, victims get this wrong. So I always say to folks in the field, especially around issues of safety planning, that we can never really know what he's capable of. But if she is communicating that she feels he could kill her, even if our risk markers are not suggesting that is the case, then we clearly will pay attention to that. And the fourth marker that Snyder et al. Found, or the fourth question to ask, was, have you ever been beaten by him while you were pregnant? And this is difficult information sometimes to get, but that abuse history, and this is something that battered women are often very ashamed of to talk about, because pregnancy can be a very tender time in relationships. But it's important to know if he's beaten her while she was pregnant. And the last marker, the fifth most important marker they found, is, has he ever used a weapon or threatened you with a weapon? And I've already talked about that, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But then there are some other aspects of a prior history of domestic violence that may not speak to direct violence, but that speak to the nature of the relationship. And here we're talking about very, very rigid control, rigid surveillance of routines, incredible inspection of daily routines, wanting to know where someone is, wanting to know what someone's doing, who they're with, when they're there, tracking them by time. Very minute inspection of daily routines. A couple of other things I think that are important to note too are what I call twists in the abuse. Something changes. Something different occurs in this prior history of domestic violence. I mean, it may be a new form of abuse. It may be something sinister. It may be something that's not prosecutable. I worked a case many years ago where the batterer would come into bed and place his loaded gun on the nightstand before getting into bed. And the victim reported this to her advocate, and he expected her to have sex after placing the gun on the nightstand. He never pointed the gun at her. He never threatened her with the weapon. This is not something that necessarily could have been prosecuted, but this was a change in the behavior. And we see these changes in behavior. We see changes in behavior in suicide cases as well. So looking for twists in the abuse, changes in the batterer's emotional demeanor or his actions, strike me as important. Within 3 weeks, that woman was dead. We see changes to an entrapment, a closing down of her options in the case. And this is very important for us. When we do fatality review work, we try to see the case through the lens of the victim or the decedent, the person who lived the case. So we reconstitute her ways of life. We piece them together again through the review. And what we find is that she feels often increasingly entrapped. Her options are closed down. Now, to the professionals working the case, whether they be law enforcement, the court system, civil courts, advocacy, medical professionals, school counselors, whoever, they may feel as though she has a whole stack of options out there to choose from. But that really, for us in this field, is not really that interesting. What is our concern is to access how the victim perceives her own predicament, how she feels she can maneuver, what her resistive maneuverability, as I call it, looks like. And if she feels entrapped, we often see that before a homicide. And the entrapment is not just about physical space. It's not just about being confined, although that may clearly be part of it. It's about this strange kind of bond that exists between the parties. And the psychologists sometimes who work these cases like to call this traumatic bonding. I wanted to give one example of this. And we worked a review a while ago, and I won't say which state it was in, but the victim left the abuser, and the victim's daughter actually paid for the victim to get away. She was in enormous danger. And she got away with her U-Haul, and she was traveling to another state. And he called her and he said, you know, he just got medical news that he was dying of cancer, and she went back, and he killed her when she got back. Physically, she was 100+ miles away from him, but emotionally, she was still connected. So I'd like to move on now and talk about another set of red flags connected with pending or actual separation or emotional estrangement. And again, we see, if we see a prior history of domestic violence in probably 80% of domestic violence killings, intimate partner killings, as an event that happens before the killing, we see that history. In 60 to 70% of cases, we probably see a separation. And different states show different data on this. The Canadian data, which is very thorough, shows that separation is actually right up there at about 80% of cases with a prior history of domestic violence. So the separation of the parties obviously can take physical form. She's moving out, she's moving on, she may be moving on to another partner, there may be a pending divorce, there may be a child custody agreement, separation, visitation arrangement, all these kinds of things, some kind of marital dissolution settlement. These are all things that we can count in the file and access. So we know those things are happening. But I think underneath all of that, it's very important to look at what I call emotional estrangement. Because the emotional estrangement speaks to the increasing unraveling of his own psychological state prior to the killing. These two in this relationship read each other with enormous sensitivity. She understands his mood very finely. And when if she begins to move in a different direction, perhaps she's going to school. Perhaps she's beginning to assert herself in different directions. Maybe she's making friends in different directions. He interprets this as a threat to himself. And this is one of the areas where superficial interpretations of power and control wheel dynamics can really get us in trouble. If we just assume that the offender is all powerful and all controlling, and that she has no agency, she doesn't engage in, as I mentioned earlier, resistive maneuverability, then we can really get ourselves into trouble with these cases. He is powerful, clearly, in many ways, physically and otherwise, maybe in terms of finances, maybe in terms of his job, in terms of his social standing. He appears to be powerful and controlling. But in many ways, emotionally, men who kill and batterers are not good at getting close to someone emotionally. And they're not good at sustaining intimate relationships. And they are emotionally, in many ways, very powerless and very much out of control in terms of their own emotion and their own emotional intelligence. And what we see is, as she begins to move away from him, he perceives that as a major threat to his identity because she is his connection in many ways, his very limited connection to the world of feeling. Men who kill are often extraordinarily isolated human beings. And this is something that batterers who kill share with mass killers and serial killers. They're extremely emotionally isolated. So when she moves in a different direction emotionally, he is enormously threatened by that. Enormously threatened. The attachment is broken. It's rather like a baby when the attachment is broken. He is dependent on her, he is vulnerable at the same time as he appears powerful. So the separation is acutely difficult, and she may not realize how vulnerable and dependent he sometimes is. And we're not talking here about all types of batterers. Clearly there are different batterers. There are some batterers, there's a wonderful book written a number of years ago called Pit Bulls and Cobras, which separated these out, but basically the cobras are kind of cold and strike quickly, and we have a small number of batterers, maybe 15%, who fit this bill. The vast majority are sort of this pit bull, constantly angry, rageful type, who are underneath probably very vulnerable and dependent too. But with the sociopathic batterer who's colder, you may not see this kind of threat at an emotional level when there's a separation or emotional estrangement. But nevertheless, in general, separation is a dangerous time. So it does behove us to think carefully about this time period of moving apart with safety planning and other precautions. And again, I think that the caveat here is the guideline. We do not know what he's capable of doing, but engaging openly in behaviors that humiliate and shame the batterer further put the victim at risk, potentially, even more. So bearing that in mind with safety planning is important. So I wanted to go on now and talk about obsessive possessiveness and morbid jealousy. I've already mentioned it, but with the domestic violence cases, before the homicides, what we see is an obsessiveness. And by obsessiveness, we're talking here about a repetitiveness to behavior that is accompanied by a number of other behaviors. And stalking would be one example of that behavior. Things like sleeplessness, pacing the floor, really there's a constancy to the jealousy and the paranoia that really is a prominent theme in these cases. He will kill rather than lose her, and he will issue those threats. So it's important to log those threats. It's important to know two things. It's important to know if she's moving on to a new partner, because that will clearly escalate the threat, because you combine the separation and the obsessive possessiveness, that's a potent threat right there. But it's also important to ask the second question. Does he think, realistically, regardless of whether she has another partner, does he think that she has another partner? So the next set of markers that I want to mention link up with, sorry, I just want to say a few words about depression before I go on. Clearly, if you put these things together, these guys who kill are not happy campers, if I can put it indelicately. They are often depressed. They may not be officially diagnosed as depressed, but they are often depressed. They are hopeless. And it's important to ask, because when we dig into these cases, we sometimes see histories, not only of depression and medication pattern use, but suicide attempts, suicidal ideations, plans, and maybe even a history of institutionalization for mental health issues. And this is a question I always ask on risk assessment activities that I engage in. Has he been institutionalized? And that's sometimes difficult information to get, or you can get it through the family. But we want to know if he's suffering from depression. If we're at a crime scene, for example, and there is medication in plain view, it is helpful to log what that medication is. And no one's encouraging anyone to breach the Fourth Amendment here or due process rules by opening up medicine cabinets. But if there's medication in plain view, and if it's antidepressant medication, if it's sleep medication, if it's anxiety medications, I can't tell you how many cases we reviewed at the initiative where we have medication cocktails, particularly combinations of medications in multiple killings like familicides. So that depressive element is important. Moving on to the next slide, the alcohol use compounds the depression. Alcohol drug use, we have the best data on alcohol use, and what Jacqueline Campbell found in her research as probably one of the most discerning questions to ask around alcohol use is the offender in the habit of becoming drunk on a daily or near daily basis? So it's the chronicity of the alcohol use that is the signifier of risk. And what she found in the differences between her homicide group and her control group was a 4.1-fold difference between those two in the unadjusted odds ratios. So that alcohol is important to know. And we often think, well, you know, if someone's stumbling around and so drunk that they can't function, they're unlikely to be able to kill. This is not the case. They're quite capable of doing that, and we see that chronic alcohol use constantly in these cases. Another issue to address is, what is his reaction to authorities, to agencies of social control at the police and the courts? In my research in Florida, where I analyzed 67 cases of intimate partner homicides involving female victims, and where we had access to a large amount of data, I found that roughly 50%, just over 50% of those abusers who killed had prior histories of police contact. And I think there are questions to ask here about levels of defiance, responses to authorities. Many people who engage in domestic violence, and I'm talking about situational couple violence here, disorderly conduct related domestics as well, many of those folks, and that may be the majority of cases, many of those folks are deterred by the presence of police officers, deterred by a judicial admonition or a judicial order. What we're interested in these homicide cases is those offenders that are not. So I think we can broadly say that there are two groups here, and they may correspond to the pit bulls and the cobras that I mentioned earlier. They may not. We need more research on this. But there are those batterers who are angry and rageful and are non-compliant. And those are what I would call overt resistors. We know they're resistant. We need to log that, track that, and that is a problem. But then there's a smaller group, I think, that we might call covert resistors, who are maybe closer to sort of a sociopathic kind of type, who are manipulative, who are devious, who are clever, who know how to work the system. And there in particular, in those cases, it's important for us to reconcile different bodies of knowledge and work together within the system to track offenders like that. It's also important, I think, although we don't have definitive risk research data on this, domestic violence offenders often have criminal histories of violence. It's important to log that. We've already talked about abuse during pregnancy. I want to say a few words here about the presence of stepchildren in the home. Clearly, many families reconstitute, and they do very well. Large numbers of families do. But it is clear that the presence of a stepchild in the home does increase the level of risk. And that risk is a significant increase. But I think that we have to ask various questions about what this looks like. And we need to ask questions about the relationship between the batterer and the stepchild in the home. What is the nature of that relationship? Is it, for example, a relationship between a male batterer and a teenage, adolescent girl that maybe has a sexual flavor to it? There may be sexual abuse going on in that relationship. That is a possibility. We've certainly worked a number of cases where that has been the case. So questions to ask there might include, is there a possibility of outing that sexual abuse or making it public? Has she reached a point, the adolescent girl, where she's going to disclose that? That may increase the risk. But the presence of stepchildren in the home seems to elevate risk 2 to 3-fold. If that child obviously is the child of another male or previous male partner. The research I mentioned earlier about economic influences is really important. And this doesn't appear on the slide, but I wanted to say a few words about this. We find unemployment as a major factor. Poverty is a major factor in intimate partner homicides. Clearly, offenders kill and they're well-to-do, but many cases involve economic stress and poverty. And ascertaining changes in one's economic standing are very important. And we note this particularly with multiple killings, but if he's lost his job, if his shame has increased, we need to note that. If he feels as though he can't provide for his family, these are important markers, and there's some very interesting research on this topic. And I'm going to just briefly refer listeners to the work of James Gilligan, who wrote a book entitled Violence. And quite frankly, it's the best book I've ever read on violence. Gilligan works as a psychiatrist, or did at least, in the prison system in Massachusetts. And he argues in the book that shame, rather than power in many ways, is perhaps a better way of looking at the roots of violence, and assessing the shame of a male provider who's fallen on hard times, but has a number of the other risk markers present as well that we've talked about, might be a very good way of doing that. And violence is a very good way, a temporary way, of discharging distressed emotional states such as shame, fear, and rage and anxiety. And we see all of those emotional states in men who kill. So assessing the economic state of his life, their life as a family, is important. So again, as I mentioned earlier with the familicides, if there's a pending bankruptcy, foreclosure on a mortgage, loss of a job, falling on hard times, other things here might involve some kind of physical injury on the abuser's part where he is unable to work. We've worked a number of familicides in particular where men have suffered from disease, muscle wasting, for example, things like this where he can no longer function. These are dangerous junctures in relationships. So noting those, I think, is important. I want to go on now with the next slide up and talk just very briefly about immigration issues. And we clearly have, we could run a whole webinar just on these issues, so I'm just going to touch on this. But the research coming, a large study out of New York published by Victoria Fry's group back, I think, in 2009, and with a large sample size, showed that immigration status clearly elevates risk of intimate partner homicide, maybe even a doubling or more of the risk in those cases. And the peculiar plight faced by immigrant victims, undocumented or not, is something that we need to pay, obviously, very close attention to. So regardless of one's politics on this, that immigration status clearly matters. Just a word now on age differences in these relationships, and this is something that we've known about in the research for quite a long period of time, but it seems as though a 10 or more year difference in the age of the perpetrator and the victim, it doesn't matter what direction that difference resides in, increases the risk of homicide. So that's something that we can read fairly easily from the files, from the data. I now want to go on and say perhaps more than a few words about head injuries, TBI, traumatic brain injury, and PTSD. There's a significant literature that links domestic violence, the commission of domestic violence, with head injury. And head injury is a significant predictor of being a batterer. We have some significant research on that. We've had that research for 20 years or more. And it's clear, too, that if someone is traumatically brain injured, if you take a sample of traumatically brain injured patients, more than 2/3 of those tend to display irritability, and aggressive behaviors that are described by family members as significantly distressing. And just for what it's worth anecdotally, when I participate in fatality reviews, I sometimes go to prison with review teams as part of my work, and sometimes as a researcher I've done this. In nearly all the cases where I've interviewed offenders in prison, I've found when we've dug and we've done life histories that those men have had histories of serious head injuries. I interviewed a gentleman who was thrown from a horse and kicked in the head by a horse when he was a teenager. I interviewed another man who actually was guilty of attempted murder and convicted of that offense, and he had been in a motor vehicle accident and was in a coma for a few days. I mean, looking for these markers is important. Also, obviously, with returning veterans, the issue of PTSD becomes very important. And, you know, we need to know whether people have PTSD, what they've experienced, and what services are provided to them. And how we get this information is tricky, but knowing what they've been exposed to is important. There is literally, I think, no literature that I can refer to that's a scientific literature on the links between a head injury, traumatic brain injury, and PTSD and domestic violence homicide. And we need that research. Maybe we need that research in conjunction with military authorities, but we need researchers to do that work. And that's something that I always ask, that I want to know. We don't have the verification of that as a risk marker, but nevertheless, it's something certainly that I look for. With the PTSD, we're gonna ask victims if he may be having disturbing memories, flashbacks, feelings of reliving violence, reliving horrendous experiences during military service, whether they're flashbacks, nightmares, increased startle responses, hypervigilance, all these different things are things that we need to look at. If I could go on and say a few words about perpetrator mental illness. Very few domestic violence killers, intimate partner killers, when we unpick the case, unravel what happened before, there are very few cases where the perpetrators are suffering from things like delusional behavior, breaks with reality, hallucinations, things that might be part of a diagnosis, say, for schizophrenia. We're probably looking at less than 5% of offenders having those kinds of profiles and those kinds of diagnoses. But clearly, as I've said before, the issue of depression and major depression is very important. So in that regard, major depression may be a very significant marker. We do see a significant number of what folks might describe, the psychologists might label personality disorders, borderline personality sort of access to diagnoses in the histories, or they are diagnoses that are made sort of maybe even post-killing, if that's the case. But nevertheless, they do seem to be somewhat important. Okay, remaining cognizant of time, I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I now want to move on to the last part of this presentation and talk about the system itself. And the system, not to suggest the system works as a cohesive whole, but clearly the system itself can present risks to victims. Systems sometimes don't understand victims. Systems don't handle cases in ways that work necessarily for victims. Sometimes systems may be more hostile to victims than maybe is in the interest of good public policy, and I'm thinking here about things like threatening, contempt, perjury, involving court cases, failure to listen to information, failure to realize that victims themselves in many ways are experts in their own lives and in other ways, tend to be somewhat ill-informed about what he's capable of. It's very difficult for systems to handle these very complicated cases. So it's clear that when we interview surviving family members, which is a very important part of our risk assessment work, sorry, not our risk assessment, our fatality review work, clearly we look there to get a sense of how victims read the system. And what we find is that really there are two groups of victims who end up being killed in the fatality review literature. And I think the research probably comports with this, the sort of the work researchers do. There's one group of victims who, you know, basically do not access the system. They do not call police. They do not go through the courts, take out orders of protection. They do not call shelters. They do not reside in shelters. And my guess would be, and it is a guess, that the majority of victims fit this profile of either not availing themselves of services that the system provides, or of taking only minimal advantage of the services we provide. That begs the question for us as folks who do this work and try to contribute towards prevention. It begs the question, what is it about the systems that maybe isn't working for victims? And in death review work, we often ask different agencies and representatives that are at the table, you know, what might be going on here? What might be happening with victims that somehow they don't, or they're not able to avail themselves of system services? Do victims feel alienated? Are the cases difficult to work? Do the victims feel that they can handle their own safety better than the system can, et cetera, et cetera? This whole issue of the large number of victims who don't access services raises very important questions. But one clear implication here is that the system itself is perceived by victims to present risks, and that the system cannot ultimately protect victims without some serious intervention and protection. And then the other, probably less than half of the victim population that dies probably does have anywhere from you know, some to substantial systems contact. And when we do death reviews in those cases, and in particular here, when we construct timelines of cases and where we look at not just the risk markers in cases, when we look at the agencies that are involved and we count their involvement, what we find is that in the vast majority of those cases where women end up being murdered, death review teams are saying the collaboration, the communication, the coordination, cooperation, and overall integration of systems in those cases is something that left a lot to be desired. In other words, there were things that could have been done to improve communication. And again, this is not to blame the death on the system, but it's to acknowledge the excellent work of review teams that have come together to reflect on what is happening in these cases. So the recommendations of those teams often speak to the need to improve communication. And one of the things that has come out, obviously, of those conversations is the call for risk assessment, which is why I spent some time earlier talking about risk assessment. But if we are going to do risk assessment, it's very important for us to know what victims as groups, what maybe focus groups of victims perceive to be the challenges with doing risk assessment. At the moment, the state of affairs, the sort of recommended best practices in some jurisdictions across this country involve law enforcement officers conducting risk assessments sometimes and recommending strongly, sometimes urging, sometimes some might say even pressuring victims to call shelters or to call domestic violence programs because they think that that is the best outcome. In other words, she would be safer, and this is a very well-intentioned intervention. And she may well be safer, but the reality is that we do not have the data on whether she is safer going to shelter versus doing something else, versus going to a hotel, versus going back to the abuser. So these are very difficult questions for us. So getting a sense of from victims about how they feel about the risk assessment protocols and practices that we've put in place is very important. And I'm looping back now to where I started, but asking victims how they perceive the issue of discovery and disclosure, and asking victims to talk about how they might disclose information, what they would share if they knew that it would be disclosed versus what they would share if they knew it was confidential, what they would share with a victim advocate that has confidentiality protections versus a law enforcement officer. These are important questions. So knowing how our risk assessment and management protocols are perceived by victims and how they act upon them and how they are used in safety planning is really important. And I wanted to close out this conversation on that note. But I wanted to also, just before I go to questions, mention something that I do think is potentially really encouraging. And that if we look at intimate partner homicide over the last 30 years, if we look at the annual rates of intimate partner homicide over the last 30 years, it seems those rates have gone down significantly, particularly in African American communities. Now, the reasons for this appear to be complicated. And there's been some research on this. There's some research that suggests that the provision of certain systems services has been helpful here. Clearly this decline, and the rate decline is quite significant, and we're talking here about maybe a 30 to 35% decline over 30, 40 years, and that's pretty significant. And there are some who have suggested that we've improved our levels of coordination, we've improved the way we work together, we're doing a good job, and we're saving lives, and we're saving lives more frequently than we might think. And so that's the bright side of the research. But I would be remiss in not mentioning that there are other sides to this as well. And one side to this is that we have improved our blood clotting technologies, and we've improved the delivery of emergency medical services to the inner city areas that before the rise of community policing were off limits. Well, not off limits, but were much less accessible to emergency medical services and police for that matter. So in other words, we've stemmed the tide of blood flow in those cases, and what would have been a homicide 30 years ago is now maybe an aggravated assault or an attempted murder. So it could be that the delivery of medical services, EMT services, etc., in the inner city, particularly in those African American communities that I mentioned earlier, that have attended the rise of community policing, have made a difference as well. So the picture is a complicated picture. So I think on that note, and the potentially cheery note, I'm going to now open it up for questions, and the team here has thrown some questions my way. One question here concerns the age difference between the parties in these risk assessments. And the age difference, I maybe neglected to mention it, but the age difference was in fact 10 years or more. 10 years or more age difference in those parties is the thing to look for. Another question concerned the reference that I made to the research on cobras and pit bulls. The reference there is to Neil Jacobson's book. Neil Jacobson wrote this book with John Gottman, published back in 1998. And it's called, the formal title is, From When Men Batter Women. And they did some excellent work looking at the dynamics of those cases, and that's where they unravel the differences between pit bulls and cobras. And they basically talk about pit bulls being the majority of domestic violence offenders, and they talk there about pit bulls engaging in sort of slow, rageful burn as opposed to the sort of lightning strike of the cobra. And you know, the pit bulls perhaps are more amenable to change than the cobras. As I mentioned earlier, the cobras tend to be more deeper embedded in their sort of sociopathology. So that's that one. There's another question here concerns the probability of intimate partner homicide when there has been no prior weapons use. And I just want to be really clear about this. And we know this from the international data. The availability of guns in the United States obviously is very high, but it's not so much the availability of guns or the prior use of weapons. It's not the only marker here. If we don't have that happening, I've mentioned a large number of other markers that we need to pay attention to. And indeed, in England, the country where I grew up, the availability of weapons is much, much less, but men still kill women to a significant degree. And indeed, if we look in countries like Switzerland, where there is high availability of weapons, the intimate partner homicide rates tend to be much less than they are in the US. So the weapons use is one marker of many, and I would really go back to that original research that I talked about from the Canadians. Their 2014 data suggesting that, you know, 86% of their killings, and they looked at, I think it was 251 deaths, 86% of those involved 7 or more risk markers. So it's clusters and combinations of risk markers that seem to be important rather than individual risk markers. Another question concerns the use of waivers in risk assessment when victims refuse information. You know, I'm not quite sure where this question is coming from, and I'm not suggesting or recommending for a second that we automatically go down this path of requesting waivers, but we cannot guarantee that the information that we give to victims about risk is in any way foolproof or predictive in any solid way. So, you know, we cannot necessarily say with any certainty that if we go down path A versus path B, the victim will be safer. So I'm raising a question, and I'm going to refer you to an article from the research literature or the legal literature that addresses this in considerable detail. And that is the research of Margaret Johnson. And this is controversial research, and I'm not saying that I agree with it for a second, but nevertheless, the article that Margaret wrote was called Balancing Liberty, Dignity, and Safety. And that article was published in the Cardozo Law Review in 2010. And what she asks there is that given the vulnerability of victims, especially in times of crisis, ought we not be using the same kinds of concerns that we might use with a patient who enters a medical facility, or indeed that a researcher might use at a university when they're conducting human subjects research? In other words, we ask people to sign an informed consent. You know, we're telling you that these things happen in homicide cases, and these things are happening in your case. It may not mean it's, you know, it's a rare offense, therefore it may not mean this is going to happen in your case, and we're not here to frighten you or terrify you, but do we ask in advance if victims are going to sign a waiver in some way to deal with that issue? As I say, I throw that out as a question. Another question that I've just got concerns risk and safety planning in the South Asian community. And I spent very little time here dealing with race, ethnicity, culture, and again, it's probably a whole separate webinar, but clearly, in different cultural settings, we see different issues. And one of the issues in the South Asian community clearly is this issue of potentially multiple perpetrators. In other words, women not just being the victims of a batterer per se, but women who have perhaps come to this country who have become more accustomed to American ways of life, who are beginning to step out of their gender roles, or daughters who, raised in the United States, don't adhere to perhaps more traditional cultures from where they came from. Here the perpetrators may be multiple. There may be many perpetrators here that will work against these victims. This makes safety planning clearly much more difficult. It makes rendering supports much more difficult. So I think that, you know, one of the things to bear in mind is that the threats to women and to men sometimes really ought to be ascertained or identified within the context of their communities. We know, for example, that the sex ratio of killing is much higher in African American communities than, say, in Hispanic communities. In other words, a much larger number of women kill men in African American communities, and always have done, than they do in Hispanic communities, Latino communities, and in South Asian communities. And this raises questions too about self-defense, about how we safety plan, about women's access to services potentially. So context, meaning, very important in assessing risk. Another question concerns the percentage of women killed by domestic violence. Just very briefly, nationally, about 40%, 35 to 40 to 45% of women who are murdered in this country are murdered by intimate partners domestic violence, people they know, former partners, etc. If you look at men who are killed in those settings by former intimates or current intimates, it's only around 4%. So there's a dramatic difference there, just to address that question. There's a question too about surviving children that witness perhaps or experience within earshot or in the same household the killing of one of their family members, usually their mother. And again, this is the topic of a separate webinar, but very clearly those children suffer acute PTSD issues, and they suffer acute shame issues that are way in excess of the normal shame and humiliation issues that they would experience if their parents, say for example, died of cancer prematurely, or one of their parents. What they have in their struggle through life is this sort of dual identity crisis where they see themselves as the child of a victim and the child of a perpetrator. And the question originally asked concerns, are these children likely to grow up to be perpetrators or victims as adults? And the answer to that question is very definitely yes. We know from our studies they are more likely. They are more likely to have all kinds of negative health outcomes, suicidality, drug and alcohol use, problems at school, and repeating the violence potentially, particularly for males. They are more likely to become abusers. The majority of them won't, but they're more likely to become abusers than a control group who have not experienced that. And for victims, if they are female, who survive the loss of a parent, they are also much more likely to become victimized and sexually abused as adults, but also within the families that they enter, perhaps when they move on to a new family situation. So I think the next question concerns economic dependence as a risk marker. And I'm going to just claim ignorance on this one in terms of the intimate partner homicide literature. I'm not aware of a correlation between pure economic dependence and intimate partner killing. There may be one. I haven't seen a case-control study that addresses that particular issue. What I am aware of from our research at the initiative on multiple killings is that, particularly in the familicides, we see very strong sex stereotyping. We see the killings occurring in very traditional relationships, especially where there's no history of domestic violence. We see acute economic dependence of women on men. Very traditional sexual division of labor in those families. So there I would say, yes, that acute economic dependence is a risk marker. But, you know, is that, you know, very, very few cases where there is economic dependence of a woman on a man or vice versa even are going to end up in homicide. So you've got to run the odds here. The chances are, I think, very slim. Another question, and we've got a lot of questions, so I'm trying to cover most of them. Another question concerns the risk of killing children in the context of adult domestic violence. Very briefly, and we do have a full day of this, on this issue, the intersection of adult and child abuse and neglect, adult domestic violence, at our conference on May 20th, our Learning from Each Other conference. But, you know, very briefly, in, I would say, 40 to 50% of the cases of child abuse and neglect deaths that we've worked over the years and that the research has worked over the years, and I am specifically referencing now research I published in 1999 in my book, Understanding Domestic Homicide. I analyzed 83 cases of child abuse and neglect deaths in chapter 6 in that book. And in those cases, there were 57 of those 83 cases where there was two parents or caretakers in the home. Of those 57 cases, 30 of those cases, 52%, evidenced woman battering. In other words, the woman was being battered at the same time as the child abuse and neglect was being meted out. And certainly, those of you who do expert witness work, or those of you who are police officers who work these cases, are well aware that there are many situations where a woman is being battered. It may not be evident at first sight where we see a child death. And often we've got a male abuser who abuses the child, who violently kills the child, typically a younger child, in circumstances that may even be construed as the abuser being jealous of the child and the child's relationship with the mother. So, yeah, the risk in some ways is increased if domestic violence is present in child abuse and neglect cases. It is one of the huge areas of disconnect between Child Protective Services and the protection of adult victims of domestic violence. It's something that clearly we need to work on much more. And I think we are getting to the end of our questions. I don't see any more in my list. Oh, yes, I do. Thank you. There's a question here concerning what's the root prevention measure to prevent intimate partner homicide? In other words, how can we prevent this? And of course, that's the million-dollar question, right? But just a number of responses here. I think clearly working together is suggestive that we've learned from each other, and we've learned to respect each other more in the work that we do and trust each other as multiple agencies with interdisciplinary approaches, that we've had an impact. And I think that's correct. But I think also we need to do a better job of screening dangerous offenders, and some of our risk work helps us to do that. But I also think, and this is anecdotal, I've got no proof for this, but these killings are often about poverty. They're often about lack of available housing, and they're often about lack of job readiness skills, job opportunities, available childcare services. These are things that are much more sort of macro social issues that we need to address. So I think that you know, to close this conversation out, we really do need to think more broadly about domestic violence. It's an intimate partner homicide. It's much more than just about the criminal justice system. Obviously, it's a social problem. Obviously, it's a gendered problem. It's a problem that concerns power relationships between men and women. And it's about masculinity and femininity. It's about a cluster of things. So clearly, we have to get at all of these issues. So I think on that note, I'm going to just say a few words about our conference, our final slide here. Just to reiterate, as Stephanie said earlier, we have our 2015 conference on fatality review, communities and social change. We're going to be looking at change issues to see what we have for folks. We'll be running a whole series of workshops celebrating the work of communities, and we'll be running concurrent mock reviews, actual working of cases for folks to learn how to do case reviews during that time. So on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your participation, your questions. It was very kind of you to take some time out of your schedule to be with us. We hope you found this valuable. You'll receive an evaluation survey for today's webinar. We are exploring how to house the webinar recordings on our website, and we will get back to you with that information. But from the Family Violence Institute at Northern Arizona, I'd like to thank you and wish you a good day, and thank you for all the superb work that you do in the field. Thanks very much.